When we talk about having few friends, the first misunderstanding we need to clear away is the idea that social quantity is a measure of personal worth. It isn't. For many people, especially those with a reflective and psychologically mature temperament, relationships are not collectible. They are experiences, they are spaces where attention, presence, and emotional truth are exchanged. And those things are finite. You can't spread them infinitely without thinning them out. People who value depth over popularity approach relationships the way a craftsman approaches their work, slowly, carefully, with discernment. They are less interested in how many people know their name and far more interested in who truly knows their inner world. This immediately places them at odds with a culture that rewards visibility, networking, and constant social stimulation. When everyone is encouraged to be everywhere and connected to everyone, choosing selectivity can look like withdrawal. In reality, it is a form of clarity. Psychologically, this trait often emerges from a strong capacity for introspection. If you spend time observing your own thoughts, emotions, and contradictions, you quickly realize how rare genuine understanding actually is. Casual conversation can be pleasant, but it rarely satisfies the deeper human need to be seen and understood. Over time, people who are oriented toward depth stop investing heavily in interactions that remain on the surface, not because they judge others, but because they feel the cost of emotional dilution. This is where the paradox appears. The more you value emotional richness, the fewer environments can provide it. Depth requires time, patience, and mutual vulnerability. It asks for listening without immediately responding, for silence without discomfort, for disagreement without rupture. Not everyone wants that. Not everyone can tolerate it. And that's not a flaw, it's simply Philosophically, Dessalines with an old idea that a good life is not a busy life, but a meaningful one, meaning doesn't scale well. You cannot have dozens of intimate bonds without transforming intimacy into something symbolic rather than lived. Those who instinctively understand this often choose fewer relationships, not as a strategy, but as a consequence of their values. This perspective is very present in the work of Christophe André, who often reminds us that mental balance is less about accumulation and more about alignment. When your social life reflects who you truly are rather than who you think you should be, a certain calm emerges. You stop performing. You stop maintaining unnecessary roles, and that calm, while deeply nourishing, also narrows the circle of people who can walk alongside you. There is also an emotional courage involved here. Choosing depth means accepting loneliness at times. It means tolerating gaps between meaningful connections instead of filling them with noise. Many people fear these gaps and rush to close them with constant interaction. Those who don't, those who can sit with silence without immediately anesthetizing it, often discover that fewer relationships feel fuller than many shallow ones. Importantly, valuing depth does not mean rejecting others. It means refusing to rush closeness. Trust, for these individuals, is not automatic. It is built through consistency, emotional honesty, and shared values. Until those conditions are met, distance feels more respectful than false intimacy. Again, this naturally results in fewer friendships, but stronger ones. In a way, this trait is an act of resistance. Resistance against a social model that equates being known with being valued. Resistance against the idea that loneliness is always a problem to be solved, rather than a signal to be understood. People who prioritize depth listen to that signal. They ask, what kind of connection am I really seeking? And they wait until the answer appears in the form of a person, not a crowd. If you recognize yourself, here the invitation is not to become more social, but to become more honest about what nourishes you. When you stop measuring your life by numbers and start measuring it by resonance, you may find that having few friends is not a lack at all, but a quiet form of wealth worth protecting. Another reason some people have few friends has nothing to do with social ability and everything to do with inner solidity. High self-awareness and independence quietly reshape how relationships are formed, maintained, and sometimes let go. When you know yourself well, you no longer look to others to tell you who you are, and when you no longer need that validation, your social life inevitably changes. Self-aware individuals spend time examining their thoughts, emotion, motivation, and contradiction. They notice when they are acting out of fear, habit, or the desire to belong. This awareness creates freedom, but it also removes certain social shortcuts. You stop laughing at jokes that feel hollow. You stop maintaining connections that require you to shrink or perform, not dramatically, not angrily, but steadily. And over time, this quiet honesty reduces the number of people who remain close. Indépendance plays a central role here. Emotional independent people are capable of enjoying others without depending on them to stabilize their mood or sense of worth. They don't use friendship as a shield against emptiness or boredom. This makes their relationships healthier, but also rarer. Many social bonds are built unconsciously on mutual dependency, reassurance exchanged for presence, approval traded for loyalty. When you step outside that system, fewer relationships function as before. There is something subtly unsettling about people who are comfortable on their own. They don't rush to fill silence. They don't constantly seek affirmation. They can disagree without becoming anxious about rejection. This scale autonomy is often misread as distance or detachment, when in fact it reflects inner grounding. But not everyone feels at ease around someone who doesn't need them. Indépendance, paradoxically, can create social friction. From a psychological perspective, this trait is closely linked to a stable internal locus of control. These individuals experience themselves as the primary agents of their lives. Their choices are guided by values rather than social pressure. Friendship, for them, is not a requirement for identity, but an enrichment of it. An enrichment, by definition, is optional, not compulsory. This is where the misunderstanding often arises. Having few friends is mistaken for isolation, when it is actually the result of discernment. Self-aware people are sensitive to misalignment. They feel it in conversations that lack sincerity, in relationships that revolve around status, gossip, or competition. Over time, they learn to trust that discomfort. They choose coherence over inclusion. Philosophically, this reflects an important idea. Freedom is not doing whatever you want, but wanting what truly suits you. When your inner life is coherent, your outer life simplifies. You stop scattering yourself across too many social roles. You invest where presence is real. This simplification can look like withdrawal from the outside, but from within, it often feels like relief. In the work of Christophe André, there is a recurring emphasis on inner anchoring. He reminds us that psychological balance grows when we learn to befriend ourselves, to tolerate solitude, to listen inwardly, to stop fleeing from our own company. Once that capacity is developed, relationships are no longer a remedy for discomfort, but a meeting between two already standing individuals. This has consequences. When you no longer seek others to complete you, you naturally attract fewer, but more aligned connections. Some friendships fade simply because they were built on versions of you that no longer exist. Others never begin because you are no longer available for dynamics that drain you. This is not loss, it is evolution. There is also courage involved here. Independence means accepting that you may sometimes walk alone. It means trusting your inner compass even when it points away from the crowd. Many people sense this truth but retreat from it, fearing social invisibility. Those who don't retreat often end up with smaller circles and deeper peace. If this resonates, the question is not how to gain more friends, but how to strengthen your relationship with yourself. Because the more firmly you stand on your own ground, the less you will chase belonging, and the more meaningful belonging becomes when it arrives. As we move deeper into this reflection, another pattern becomes clear. People with few friends often have strong boundaries and a very low tolerance for what feels false, noisy, or emotionally draining. This isn't rigidity, it's sensitivity combined with discernment, and it plays a decisive role in shaping a smaller, more intentional social circle. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They determine what enters your emotional space and what does not. People who develop clear boundaries usually do so after learning, sometimes painfully, that not all relationships are neutral. Some exhaust, some confuse, some quietly erode self-respect. Once this awareness takes root, it becomes impossible to unsee. You begin to notice how certain conversations leave you scattered, how certain people demand more energy than they return, how some forms of closeness are built on obligation rather than en désir. At that point, tolerance changes. Small talk that never leads anywhere starts to feel heavy. Repetitive complaints without self-reflection become tiring. Drama disguised as intimacy loses its appeal. This is not about moral superiority, it's about nervous system intelligence. The body often understands before the mind does. You feel tension after certain interactions, a subtle contraction, a need to recover. Over time, people who listen to these signals begin to step back, not abruptly, not aggressively, but decisively. Strong boundaries also mean clarity about values. When you know what matters to you, honesty, depth, respect, emotional responsibility, you become less flexible about compromising them just to maintain connection. This is where many friendships quietly dissolve, not because of conflict, but because of incompatibilité that can no longer be ignored. The relations may continue politely, but intimacy recedes. Intimacy, once gone, is rarely replaced by habit alone. There is also a cultural dimension to this. We live in a social environment that often rewards excess, oversharing, overreacting, constant availability. Setting boundaries within this context can be misinterpreted as coldness or distance. Saying no, needing space, or refusing to engage in gossip can feel almost transgressive. People with strong boundaries accept this misunderstanding as the price of self-respect. They choose inner coherence over social comfort. Psychologically, this trait is closely linked to emotional regulation. Individuals who manage their inner states well are less drawn to external chaos. They don't need intensity to feel alive. They don't confuse stimulation with connection. As a result, they naturally move away from relationships that thrive on volatility. This again reduces the size of their social world, but improves its quality. There is something important to note here. Low tolerance for superficiality does not mean a lack of kindness. In fact, it often comes with a quiet compassion. These individuals do not confront or criticize others for being different. They simply withdraw their emotional investment. They understand that everyone has their own rhythm, their own needs. They just choose not to participate in dynamics that feel misaligned. This approach resonates strongly with the thinking of Christophe André, who often emphasizes the importance of protecting our inner life. He speaks of psychological ecology, the idea that just as we care about our physical environment, we must care about our emotional one. Not every stimulus deserves access. Not every relationship deserves intimacy. Mental health, in this sense, is not built by adding more, but by learning what to limit. Boundaries also require maturity because they force us to tolerate discomfort. It is uncomfortable to disappoint people. Uncomfortable to be less available, uncomfortable to accept that being authentic may reduce social approval. Many people avoid boundaries not because they don't know their limits, but because they fear the consequences of enforcing them. Those with few friends have often crossed this threshold. They have learned that short-term discomfort is preferable to long-term self-betrayal. As boundaries strengthen, something paradoxical happens. Relations that remain become clearer, calmer, and more respectful. There is less confusion, less resentment, less emotional bargaining, but there are also fewer of them, and that is the trade-off many are willing to make. If this speaks to you, the invitation is simple but demanding. Observe which relationships require you to abandon your limits and which ones honor them. Because every time you protect your boundaries, you are not pushing others away, you are choosing the conditio, NS, under which genuine connection can finally exist. There is one final trait that quietly brings all the others together: emotional depth and a commitment to authenticity. This is often the most misunderstood reason people end up with few friends, because from the outside it can look like intensity, seriousness, or even emotional heaviness. From the inside, however, it is simply a refusal to live on the surface of things. Emotionally deep people experience life with nuance. They don't just feel happy or sad, they sense undertones, contradictions, ambivalence. They notice what is left unsaid. They are attuned to shifts in mood, meaning, and intention, both in themselves and in others. This sensitivity is not a skill they turn on off, it is how they are wired, and it profoundly shapes how they relate. Authenticity naturally follows. When you feel deeply, pretending becomes exhausting. Performing emotions you don't feel, minimizing questions that matter to you, or maintaining a version of yourself that fits social expectation creates an inner friction that emotionally deep people cannot tolerate for long. So they stop doing it. They speak more honestly, they ask real questions, they pause instead of filling silence, and in doing so, they unintentionally raise the emotional entry level of their relationships. Not everyone wants to go there. Emotional depth invites vulnerability, reflection, and sometimes discomfort. It asks people to sit with ambiguity rather than rush towards certainty. It challenges the habit of keeping things light at all costs. Many social interactions are designed précisables to avoid this territory. So when someone consistently brings presence, sincerity, and emotional truth into a room, the response is often mixed. Some feel relieved, others feel exposed. This is one of the reasons emotionally authentic people often end up with fewer friends. It's not that they reject others, it's that they don't dilute themselves to be more palatable. They don't smooth out their edges to maintain harmony. They are willing to risk misunderstanding in order to stay aligned with themselves. And that choice quietly reshapes their social world. Psychologically, this trait is linked to emotional intelligence, but also to emotional courage. It takes courage to say, "This matters to me," when the surrounding culture prefers distraction. It takes courage to name sadness instead of disguising it as irony, or to express care without hiding behind detachment. Many people sense this courage but don't feel ready to mirror it. Distance then becomes a form of self-protection for both sides. There is also a slower rhythm at play. Emotionally deep people take time to trust. They don't rush intimacy, but when they commit, they do so fully. They listen carefully. They remember details. They show up consistently. This kind of presence is rare, but it is also demanding. It cannot be multiplied endlessly. As a result, these individuals invest deeply in a small number of relationships rather than spreading themselves thin across many. Philosophically, this reflects a very simple idea. Truth is more important than comfort. Living authentically means allowing your inner experience to guide your outer life, even when it costs you social ease. This is not a dramatic stance, it is a quiet one, but it has consequences. You become less interchangeable, less adaptable, less willing to bend for the sake of belonging, and belonging, when it does occur, becomes something earned rather than assumed. This perspective echoes strongly in the reflections of Astor's Christophe André, who often speaks about the importance of emotional sincerity as a foundation for psychological health. He reminds us that peace does not come from being liked by many, but from being faithful to oneself. When inner life and outer life align, something settles. Even if the social circle shrinks, the inner world expands. Emotionally deep people also tend to value presence over frequency. They don't need constant contact to feel connected. They prefer meaningful conversation over regular check-ins. This can be mirrored as distance or neglect, when in fact it reflects a different understanding of intimacy, one based on substance rather than repetition. Again, this narrows the field of compatible relationships. If you recognize yourself in this, the question is not how to become less intense or more socially flexible. The question is how to honor your depth without turning it into isolation. Emotional authenticity is not a flaw to be corrected. It is a capacity to be protected and directed wisely, because in the end, a life lived truthfully may be quieter, but it is also fuller. And the courage to remain yourself, even when it reduces the crowd around you, is often the very thing that makes the few connections you do have truly worth keeping.